Here we go. Okay.
All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the April 15th, 2021 meeting of the Ad Hoc Committee. Is there a motion to convene the meeting?
I make a motion to open the meeting.
Is there a second?
I second.
Is there a discussion on the motion? If no discussion, all in favor, please signify.
Aye.
Any opposed? The meeting is now open. Thank you. There are four of us in attendance now. We need two more, but we do have a quorum. I propose that we postpone this discussion on approval of the minutes for last week until next week. One, because we don't have everyone here, and secondly, because I got to this rather late in the week, namely yesterday, and so I didn't give you all much time to look at my edits. So without objection, as they say on the floor of the Congress, we will table the item number one, approval of the minutes, to next week, unless there is objection. Okay, thank you for that. Next item on the agenda is continued discussion on the code section revisions and the RACI matrix. And Ellen, I'd like to give you the floor now and have you talk through what you distributed and which is now up on the screen.
Sure. So this is separate from the RACI matrix, which we'll still be doing. But yeah, I think from some of the conversations we've been having, and I'd love to have Mike's input on this. I've been bringing up process maps. So I spent some time working on disclosure statements, and this isn't filling, the specific review. It's starting with the Board of Trustees, reviews the list every year, notifies, and it goes through who does what, all the way down to the bottom. I have a couple of things missing, like if it needs to be chased, if people don't submit the disclosure statement. But I sent this out to everybody just as an example of what a process map is, to see if this is something that we think would be beneficial in addition to the RACI matrix. And if so, for which processes? Because just this little bit took me about an hour or so. And I don't mind spending the time, but I don't want to just do it if we don't think it's worthwhile.
Well, why don't you walk us through it, and that will, I think, inform us.
Okay, so it starts with the clerk treasurer provides a list of the positions previously approved to provide the disclosure statements to the Board of Trustees. The next step is the Board of Trustees reviews the list of positions. Then the Board of Trustees finalizes the list and returns the list to the clerk treasurer and Board of Ethics. Then the clerk treasurer, and we need to verify with all the parties that I've got the right who in this. The clerk treasurer notifies all who need to submit the disclosure statements. The required VOBEC fills out the disclosure statement and returns it to the clerk treasurer. The clerk treasurer performs a basic review for completeness. I believe Sally said they just look to make sure it's notarized and all questions have been answered, but not the content. So that's what I mean by completeness. It's not accuracy. Then they send it to the Board of Ethics, and the Board of Ethics reviews for completeness and accuracy. Once it's complete, and I need to make that box bigger, the clerk treasurer maintains it as public record. If it's not complete, the Board of Ethics follows up with the covered person until complete, and then it goes to the clerk treasurer to maintain his public record. So what's missing in this, I'm making the assumption everyone who's notified submits the filled out disclosure form. So I need to have a sideline process of, if not submitted within X days, who has to chase, and then ultimately it will come in.
Any comment on that?
No,
I'll
that
tell you
seems
my reaction.
accurate.
Go ahead. I will tell you my reaction is that we are going to be providing a great many proposals for revision of the code, and a pictorial is extremely helpful to the process. It's going to be a long process, and we're going to, I envision spending a few sessions with either the Board of Trustees or representatives of the Board of Trustees, section by section, something like this, addressing an area which is, we talked about a lot and which is important, and we've changed the process too. I think this is great.
Okay, so what I'm envisioning, for us, but then I'll see about copying it into a Word document, but for us to keep reviewing, just doing multiple tabs within the one Excel workbook, so we're not looking for a gazillion files. But if you could all think about, unless you want to tell me now, where you think we need this. I'm not going to work on it for over a week since I'll be away, but I could get started when I get back.
What do you mean by where you need this, where we need this?
Where we need a process map for which bits. So I think we need one for, which we haven't agreed on the process yet. If somebody has an inquiry, who do they go to? So let's pretend, John, I know we don't agree, that the inquiry goes to the Board of Ethics. It gets submitted in writing. The Board of Ethics receives it and recognizes receipt. At the monthly meeting, the Board of Ethics reviews it, documents the response, gets back to the individual. And then the response gets stored in a way that it can be referenced going forward. So that's kind of a straightforward one. But it's just what other processes we think we need to map out.
Yeah, good question.
Yeah, I
Certainly that-
agree.
Certainly that one.
Sorry, this is like really helpful. The only thing I would add is, because like I'm a visual learner, I guess the only thing that I would add is like the dates of things, like where they apply. Like the first one, like they give them, I don't know, 2 weeks before the annual organization meeting.
Yep.
Like things like that, I would just add like dates wherever they're applicable.
Right, so we have the timing on all of this. Yep.
And I guess maybe, I mean, it's probably way too complicated, but a process map for like whenever just someone has a complaint, like an ethics complaint. But I think that's like way too
I think that's
complicated.
what just Ellen just said.
No, I said
Oh.
an inquiry.
Yeah, I'm
Oh,
saying like
right,
complaint,
Right.
which
Yeah,
is like
indeed.
crazy.
Yeah,
There's probably like 1,000 boxes for that one.
Uh-huh. Yeah,
that one I'd probably need help with, Brian.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll do the artistic work if you want to call this artistic, but with some of it, I may need help with making sure I've got the right steps.
no, that's good. You can note that in the minutes, Brian, that we are taking on, each of us, the responsibility to go through the code and look for sections that might require this, because I can see this, just thinking out loud, I can see this as an attachment to the code in the same way that a disclosure statement is an attachment to the code.
Absolutely. To me, is even though I think one of the things we were going to follow up on was, if we have this stuff as an appendix, is that still part of the code? And as long as we're taking this from the code itself, I don't see why it wouldn't be part of the code. But
Yeah. The
And-
written always has precedence over the pictorial or the numerical.
Yep.
So it can be part of the code. The language will always govern, so we need to make sure that they conform.
Mhm.
And also, going to what Ellen said, something else that, might be included in the appendix or as Exhibit A or B or C
Mhm.
would be the list of positions that the disclosure form applies to.
Yep.
Yeah. That's important. Okay. Well, thank you for this, Ellen. That's great.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions on this? Okay. If not, let's move on. Did you all see the letter we received from Robin Kramer?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, interesting issue. And we discussed it. I don't know that you can you can necessarily legislate with specifics the kind of appearance of a conflict or actual conflict that she's discussing. What I do think you can do, as I mentioned in my reply to her, is you can socialize, educate committee members and others to what a conflict is and what the appearance of a conflict can be. But I'm glad we got the letter. I'd like to get more.
I think your response was very appropriate, though. I mean, I think Robin's point is well taken, but I also think that this is really what the complicated aspect of the ethics board's responsibilities are, is both on the educational side and the informative side, as well as, making a determination, after the fact. Ideally, the ethics board would be sort of working to head off issues so that we don't have any issues where people are being brought, in an ideal world, where people are being brought or have issues that need to be brought to the ethics board. But in sort of going through ethics legislation, I think that's really, Robin hits the nail on the head, and your response was equally appropriate in the sense of there's really no way to legislate every single instance of what is ethically appropriate.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments on that? All right, I'm reluctant to get too deep into the substantive provisions of the code with four of us, but let me raise one other issue. Last week, I sent to each of you a copy of the code as amended by Mark Ettinger. And it is my intention to take one by one all of the suggestions that he made and others have made, some we've already addressed, to the code for purposes of completeness and responsiveness. I don't think I sent you my notes on Mark's edit, but
I haven't done a comparison. I'm sorry, Dan. I haven't done a comparison recently, but when Mark first sent us his edits, I did do a check against where we were working on pieces of the code versus his comments. And I think we pretty much had it all covered. Was my recollection. I might be wrong.
Well, what I did was I prepared a page of notes, and I have 11 specific sections where he made suggestions. And I thought, as I prepared for the meeting tonight, that it might be, might not be the most efficient way to approach this by going through each of these as a committee. And I thought what I might suggest to you is that I send to you my comments as a form of homework. And then if there were, before the next meeting or before we decided to discuss it, you could send back to me your own comments under each numbered paragraph. And then I'd know what we really needed to discuss. As I said, as opposed to going through every individual sentence and paragraph. What are your thoughts about that?
I'm okay with that. I mean, I think that's appropriate. I mean, anybody
I
else?
don't think it's that complicated. And we've addressed several of these sections. So I think it might be more efficient if I just sent it out and said, hey, please get back to me by next Wednesday with your comments under each of these numbered paragraphs. And this way we're not spending a lot of time possibly talking about something that's not very important. Okay, so I will do that and see if that works appropriately for you all. I think what I'm going to do now is, let me get one other macro issue out of the way. Not out of the way, but we should discuss it. I think 2 weeks ago, I sent to you an example of how I propose to present the revised code to the Board of Trustees, showing them or displaying, here's the section as we are proposing to revise it. Below that, here's the section as it exists in the current code. Below that, here are the differences. And this way, when we submit the annotated revised code to the board, they can very clearly see what changes we are proposing. What that will require on our part, and this is aside from what I hope to send them as a overall, here are the changes we made. This is what we, these are the changes we made, and here's our invoice for our work. Kidding.
No, I like that thought. What?
So insofar as that section by section description, do you guys have any thoughts about that?
I almost, as much as I think what you suggested was excellent, I almost think it's too detailed. And other than you and me, everyone else works.
But I do think, Ellen, and I agree that it is detailed, but I also think that the Board of Trustees is going to have to know the detail and the rationale, essentially why we thought a change should be made.
No, I agree that we need to explain what, I didn't mean to say we didn't need to explain what our thought process was, but I don't know who has the bandwidth to do that.
Oh, I see.
That's where I was coming from.
I think if if you all are agreed in concept that this is a good format. I'm assuming I'm going to take on a big part of this. And Ellen, I'm going to post security around your house, so I know that you are going to play a role in this.
Absolutely.
Um,
But I'll
And-
also be once we're comfortable that we're done making changes, I'm going back to finishing up the racing matrix, and then I'll be
Yes.
doing all the process maps.
Yeah, and the reason I feel I'm not too concerned about who does what on this is that, and again, tell me if you agree with me on this, is that I believe we're going to be done with our review, I would say latest the end of May or early June with the sections, and we will have agreed. We'll know what we agree on, and we'll know what we're going to tell the board. Here are different points of view on various sections. Then I think I don't intend or think it's necessary to submit the revised code in July and August. I see this as a September thing.
All right,
And
do you really think we're gonna be still revising code through the end of May, early June?
conservatively, we've got speaking, yes, because we've got Trustee Westrup meeting with us in 2 weeks. We may have others who are visiting with us. I'm being conservative on that.
Okay,
But I also, given that we were impaneled in October, we waited a while for certain information, that this need not at this point be a fire drill. July and August are July and August, they're quiet times. We obviously want to do this right. So I'm looking, and the writing part of this is going to be heavy lifting. And we all have to read these sections, and we all have to read, there's going to be also an overall report, which expresses our sense of what we tried to accomplish. So this is not my call as an individual, but I do see a final product closer to September with everything that we need to do. So
Yeah.
so that gets back to something that you had, I believe, either in an email or your agenda, about asking Nora to ask the Board of Trustees to extend our term.
yes, and Nora has,
I'll do that. I'll put it on for a week from this coming Monday. So just tell me how long.
If we're gonna have a finished product, let's say early mid-September, do we get extended through the time? This is a you, Nora, question. Do we get extended through the time we're working with the board, going through all the changes?
I would expect so.
Right,
Yeah.
so
Yeah,
then it depends how long it's gonna take us to meet with the board on it.
I mean, I don't mean to speak for Nora or the board, but just from experience, I would imagine that even after the report is finalized, you'll have to allow Board of Trustees members an opportunity to review it so that when we do meet, there can be an informed conversation,
Yep.
yeah, and I mean, I think the public's gonna have questions
Right.
for us.
So
Um,
do you want to say March or April or May or June? I mean,
I'm sorry, I was totally distracted while I'm trying to find the code to share. What is the question? I apologize.
I just
How far out should we feel that we need to be extended at this point, given that after when we have a revision in hand and a report to give the Board of Trustees, presumably the Board of Trustees will need some time to review it on their own, to have an informed conversation with us.
Let's go crazy, December 31.
You said December 31?
December, yeah, because we're talking about an extremely busy board. Do you meet in the summer, Nora?
We meet in the summer. Yeah, we meet. Well, typically we meet once a month in the summer, unless there's something else, going on. But I have to say we're a little behind in our agendas. I mean, we've had stuff on our work session for
Right.
5 and 6 meetings. So,
But these could also be special review sessions, not necessarily work session meetings, correct?
yeah, I mean, it would just be the same thing. I mean, every meeting's a meeting. It's just work sessions tend to be meetings where the public doesn't speak, and regular meetings they speak at. But every meeting's a meeting. It has to be noticed. It's the same. So maybe even like February, just to do it.
I think if we go too far out, we run the risk of it being not seen as something that needs to be resolved.
Well, you can always extend it if you say December 31st and it's not completed by December 31st. Just ask that it be extended for another month or two.
Well, let's take your advice on this. I mean, you know the board's agenda and you are much more familiar with the empanelment of committees than certainly I am, not John, of course. What do you think?
I mean,
Are you asking me or are you asking Nora?
I'm asking Nora.
I think that we're there by the time when it gets to us, that may be when there's a bit of a gap. So, but on the other hand, if we have a deadline, then we'll try and get it done. I say December 31st, and if need be, it can be extended again. It isn't a big deal.
I'm sorry, could I just say something? Like, I'm not complaining at all. I just think no one expected us to work this long. Like, I think when people like sign up, they see December 31st, 2020, and they're like, oh, I could do that. And then like things come up with both families. Like, I don't know, I'll just say I don't think anyone has expected us to work this long.
No, it was late in getting started. I mean, we were late in getting you started. That is.
And Brian, take heart in the fact that your heavy lifting is going to be done, I hope, by May, June. And after that, it's writing and drafting. If we meet, we're not going to be meeting that regularly.
Right.
And at that point, it's giving the board the edits. So I think you're off the hook to a large extent at that point.
No, I mean, I'm still going to work. I think maybe I should have said, like, I don't think anyone expected us to be working this long, not just meetings. Like, it's still a lot of behind the scenes stuff.
Right, but I don't think anybody really thought we were going to tear apart the code to the extent that we did either. But the one thing that I would say in terms of the asking for a deadline, and I'm not sure if it matters if we distinguish it, I think what I heard you say, Dan, and no one seemed to disagree, was we're targeting for all of our work to be completed in September, whether it's beginning or end of September. The extension after that is for review with the board and perhaps the village attorney.
Yeah.
And I do think that distinction's an important distinction.
You're absolutely right.
Because any extension beyond that, after December 31st is really the board saying they need to extend it. It's not us saying it.
Right.
Right.
I mean, personally, I would say October 31, but
But
I,
I think if you get the report to us sometime in September, it's still, we're gonna have to read it, review it, and if we change the code, well, we would have to set public hearings, and there's a time frame on setting the public hearing, so that, you know, that it takes at least, if a local law is, you know, set to go, it still takes probably 6 weeks to get it adopted. And I'm assuming in this law, there might be public comment that changes the law, and then you have to start the notice process all over again.
But I think as Brian has said, that's really the board's responsibility, not our responsibility.
Right, unless you want to, and you know, you can participate as individuals or as the board. You know, that's the other part of it.
I don't know. I mean, to me, it's really a question of do we want to be a constituted, you know, ad hoc committee when the discussion takes place, or are we going to let the report sort of speak, you know, not that we couldn't appear and discuss aspects of the report, but, you know, are we going to appear individually and have a conversation about it at the time? You know,
But I think that would be up to the board as to how they want us to participate at that point.
yeah, I mean, my feeling is whatever we as an ad hoc committee end up at, we present to the Board of Trustees. After that point, it's really up to the Board of Trustees to address the individual issues and also how they would like to see us move forward, and whether they want us to participate in the, you know, the public hearing process.
Well,
I foresee a lot of questions
Yeah.
about changes we made, why we made the changes, and from both individual trustees and from the board. And I think if there's a public hearing, we should all be there and answer questions. So I just see this going on for a while.
Yeah.
Yeah, I prefer to be aboard when the approval process is taking place.
So are we saying December 31?
I guess.
Okay.
I love the enthusiasm, Brian. What?
This poor guy's he's just starting out his legal career.
I don't think there's going to be that, but there won't be so many minutes, right? That Brian's just the ace minute taker.
Thank you. I try.
Is
Succeed.
okay. All right. What I'd like to do now is the minutes are identical from that is, my notes are identical from last week. I just want to go through a couple of the sections where I have made some changes based on our discussions of a few weeks ago. So I'm going to start with on page 2, the definition of confidential information. And I had revised this, but I made a change based upon the material which John sent to us from from that article of back in 2008. I like this definition a lot better. So I've substituted that one for the one I had before. And I think it conforms more with other codes. So that's confidential information. I'm just going to go through this and you stop me if there's anything that I need to address more specifically. The next was when Mr. Spolzino met with us, he said that debarment is mentioned in the code without a definition. I asked him to provide one to me. I have not heard from him, but what I did find in a couple of different journals and articles and that I searched for on the web a definition which I think is suitable. An action taken by the village to prohibit a recipient from participating in procurement contracts. I think that covers it. And I looked at several of them. Down to page oh yeah, this is one which is, I don't know that we'll ever get resolution on. This is page 12. And this is 21.5A. And it has to do with, all right, you've got the code. You've received the code. And is there a deadline to acknowledge that you've received it, and what happens if you don't acknowledge? Is failure to acknowledge grounds for disciplinary action? I think I said once before when we first discussed this, this is a minefield, and it's very, to me, dangerous to put in a sanction for failure to comply, based on my own experience from my firm. And you just don't get, people are busy and they don't reply and they don't respond, and you just can't find them or fire them or suspend them. Anyway, that's my view on it.
No, but I thought we had previously discussed, and I may have dreamt this, that, you know, we agreed we're not going to fire people, but we give them, say, 30 days, and that there's a report given to the Board of Trustees on a regular basis of who has not complied. You know, so they kind of get called out.
Yeah.
How about a disciplinary, like, letter? I mean, something of discipline. We're not going to fire them. I think we all agree.
Yep.
But some, like, a letter of caution or something.
You know, this is mandatory. You must do this.
But it's not only about the board, it's not only about the employee, it's about board members and committee members too.
Yep.
And
I was using the term employee loosely.
no, so but my point being, if I am an applicant and I'm appearing before a committee and I don't know if a committee member has read and reviewed the code of ethics and understands it, what is my recourse, you know?
So how about something that is kind of will require some sort of call to action, meaning if Dan was copied on a note to me that I hadn't signed my obligation, I would be more apt to quickly do it within a time frame to cure it. Like, so maybe just something.
But I think, to John's point, it's two paths. So if it might be three paths, 2 or 3. So we agree a straight employee, you know, the guy who works for the Parks Department, we're not going to fire. But if it's a volunteer committee member, if they don't respond within X time, they're off the committee. I don't know if we want to treat consultants the same way.
I don't think we can take people off the committee.
Okay, how come?
Well, because they have a term. So it depends. There's specific requirements in the law for the way you remove someone from the ethics board, the way you do it for the planning or zoning board. So the Board of Trustees doesn't have that jurisdiction. It has to do with, they have to have training, and some, like the planning and zoning are state enabling laws that we just adopt. So we don't really have the ability to pull people off committees.
Okay, but what about like the budget committee? You could throw
Oh.
me off, can't you?
But well, let's go back to that issue though. If you're an applicant and you're appearing before the planning board and hypothetically none of the planning board members have filled out their, reviewed the code of ethics and signed off on it and filled out their disclosure forms, why as an applicant should I be beholden to that planning board?
Well, I guess in order to remove someone from a planning board, they have to be removed for cause. So the question is not signing the ethics disclosure cause?
I would assume it would be if it's part of our code.
Okay, so then that would be a public hearing removing them for cause.
Getting very complicated for failing to return a form.
I mean, honestly, I think that we should, maybe. I think people complied more before COVID because you were in the meeting and there was often somebody who was a notary at your meeting. I think the idea of not having a notary and having an affirmation is one idea, but I just think the reminders are going to be important, and and maybe a reminder to the chair of the committee.
Right, but the notary doesn't apply for reading the code of ethics. That's for the disclosure statement, Nora.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about the annual distribution of the code.
Right, but there's the extra document that you sign. That's right. Yep.
Two different things.
Well, that's why they're using Power DMS, because you read it on Power DMS and you say that you signed it.
Exactly.
Right. But I mean, at the end of the day, there is still the distribution of the code just basically says you've gotten a copy of the code and you've read it.
Yeah. Yeah, it does. Yeah.
And it's an obligation of every employee in the village and every committee member to read and review that every year. Certainly committee members that don't read and review and don't acknowledge that they've reviewed it or read it and received it. I don't know how they could appropriately carry out their job, their position.
We can provide that failure to acknowledge can be deemed a violation of the code, and then leave it up to the village or the board to bring an action.
So what I think might have to happen is that we have a code section that's 48.2, which is removal from office due to absence. And it says the chair of each board, commission, council, and committee of the Village of Mamaroneck shall report to the village manager whenever any member of the board, commission, council, or committee fails to attend 3 meetings in the prior 12 months or 3 consecutive meetings. If the village manager concludes, after consulting with the chair and the member who has been absent, that it is unlikely the member's attendance will improve, the village manager shall remove the member from office. The village manager shall report any such removal to the Board of Trustees at its next meeting. So that's a separate code section.
Right.
And I guess, you could have removal from office due to failure to sign the disclosure form. But
It's not even signing disclosure form. It's acknowledging receipt of the ethics code.
And I would also say that I don't think this would apply to the planning board or the zoning board, because there's a different mechanism under New York state law for those removals. It also doesn't apply to elected officials, because they're elected for a term and there's a different process for removing them. So
Right.
Right. That's why I said we might have multiple paths depending on the who.
not going to be able to enact a penalty unless we generally provide that failure to comply with 21(6)(a) can be deemed a violation of the Code of Ethics and subject to appropriate action as provided by law. And that,
I think getting to Nora's point, though, I think this is a much more complicated issue because we would have to amend the planning board, the legislation for the planning board, basically saying that.
We can't do that. That's state law. We don't have jurisdiction over that. It's state code that specifies how planning or zoning board members are reviewed.
It's not recusal. Though.
No, I'm sorry. Removed. And there will be a referendum on the ballot this year that transfers the authority from the mayor solely to the entire board of trustees. And the board of trustees has the option of using a hearing officer, but it's still a public hearing removing a member of the planning board. And that's the state law. So we can't change that. That's the state requirement for planning and zoning.
Yes, but if they do not comply with the Code of Ethics in the Village of Mamaroneck, they could be subject to a public hearing.
But yes, if the ethics board finds that they have not complied with the ethics code or have an ethics violation, then that would be a referral to the board of trustees.
No, we're not saying that. I think John's saying if they have not acknowledged receipt and that they read the Code of Ethics.
Okay, but if that's an ethics violation, the remedy, the ethics board then recommends a remedy. It could be a fine, it could be, it could be removal, but it's still not up to it's still a state process for zoning and planning. It's a different process for local boards because we just appoint them, so we could change that rule. But we can't change state law, basically.
Right. So if you just said something very interesting, so let's ignore planning and zoning for a moment. I believe what I understood you to just say, if someone does not acknowledge receipt or that they've read the Code of Ethics, that's in and of itself a violation of the code.
I don't think it is now. I don't think the code says that now.
No, it doesn't, but I thought that's what you had said. And
no,
that it would...
if that's a recommendation you make.
Oh, okay. All right, then I missed that
now.
Okay.
Let's depart this subject for now. And if anyone has a great idea about language that could be a one-size-fits-all or a solution and wishes to insert some kind of sanction, then I welcome the draft language.
Why did you just cross out that it should be distributed, blah, 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 blah?
I have it above.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's just the section I did not delete when I should have deleted. It's right above.
Yep. All right. Got it.
And speaking of which, and we're going to move on, if unless someone else has another point to make on it. But I think we're stuck on the fact that there are multiple laws that apply to multiple positions for purposes of discipline or penalty or removal. So as I said, if someone's got a great idea, let's I invite it. on the same page, we had talked about the general municipal law, and I have, I think, as we agreed, provided here in 21-6A that the copy of the Code of Ethics and either a copy or an electronic link to the general municipal law shall be distributed. So that we have now brought in under that distribution the so-called poster law.
Yep.
That which is published or supposed to be posted in buildings. So I think we've covered ourselves there. Going down to same page, what I have, we talked about this is 21-5-6. I've reversed the numbering. Am I on the right page? Yeah, I've reversed. Yikes. I know. Let me find it. -5. So what I've done here is I've reversed the sections, I reversed the numbers of the sections, not the order of them. That is the physical order yet. So that the preparation of the list of persons required to file disclosure statements and the filing of disclosure statements precedes the section describing the applicability of the statements. I think we agreed on that. But I've left it the order, if not the numbering. And I've also specified, let me find it, that the list of those covered by the disclosure statements must be transmitted to the Board of Ethics within 72 hours of the annual meeting. Let me find that. So I put in the specific language. Yeah, there it is. So there's 21, the new 21-5. And as agreed, within 72 hours of the annual meeting, held pursuant to section 3-302, thank you, Nora, of the New York State Village Law, the Board of Trustees shall cause to be filed with the Village Ethics Board a list of the names, etc., required to file disclosure statements. And okay, so I've done that. Now page 20.
Dan, while we're talking order, so the disclosure statements to me are a subsection of the overall Code of Ethics.
Yeah.
So in terms of logical numbering order, should we have the distribution of the Code of Ethics first, followed by the board determining the who and blah, blah, blah for the disclosure statements, and then the disclosure statements? Because right now, I think you have 21-6 is distributing the Code of Ethics.
So you're saying distribution of code first.
Yeah,
What comes next?
the who for the disclosure, and then the actual disclosure. But does everybody agree with that? Because to me, the Code of Ethics is the big picture, and then you start drilling down into details.
I'm going to ask, I'm going to take a look at that with the code in front of me.
Okay,
And give that some thought, as we all should.
Can I,
I'm all for the right order, and I think we've made a good change in what we've just done. But I'm all, and anybody has any suggestions about any other reordering to make it more logical, absolutely, it should happen.
John, you were gonna say something?
It was not directly related to this. It was more a choice of language, going back to shall. Remember, we had this discussion previously, I think may, shall, and must.
Yep,
Um,
I see a shall right here under E.
Yeah, so just to clarify with everybody, shall is an imperative, correct?
Yes,
Not a discretionary term.
not permissive.
Got it. Just want that on the record. Just want that on the record for our discussions, because I know in the past it's come up when I was on the board. There were discussions about what shall, must, and may all meant.
And we also agreed that we're calling it the Ethics Board, not the Board of Ethics, correct?
No, the other.
Yeah, I thought we were calling it the Board of Ethics.
Then we haven't changed that.
Correct. And
Okay.
yeah, I've held off on those kinds of changes. And I also think we've agreed that we're going to render the code gender neutral and substitute they and their for the he's and the she's and the hims and the hers.
Aye.
Yep.
So that will come at the end. But I haven't gone through and done a replace on all of the pronouns or the other linguistic changes.
Yep.
16A, I've made clear that only written opinions issued by the Board of Ethics may be binding upon the board in the village. So that's clear. That goes through my notes. And Jocelyn, are you still there, Jocelyn? Yes.
I'm here. Yes, sorry,
yeah.
I'm here.
Yeah, I earlier said that what I'm going to do with other proposed changes to the code, specifically changes made by non-members of the committee, and specifically Mark Ettinger, I'm going to send those itemized changes or suggested changes to each of you on the committee and ask for comments before the next committee meeting so that we can more expeditiously go through those suggestions. If people feel important, if there are substantive comments to be made, you can vote yes, do it, don't do it, or here's how I think I would make the change. And I think that'll be a time saver for us.
Just so you know, Dan, I won't be responding to that.
I get it. I hope you have a wonderful week wherever you're going.
I'm going to Hawaii.
Ooh.
How wonderful.
Yeah.
The
The other, Jocelyn, that you missed, I don't know if you took a look at the process map that I sent out,
Yes, I did.
but we agreed that we should be doing that. So we've asked everyone to go through the code and make recommendations as to what processes should be mapped out like that.
Wow, I was only 2 minutes late.
That's all I have for the agenda this evening. Are there any other agenda items? If not, is there a motion to adjourn?
I make a motion to adjourn.
Is there a second?
A second.
Any discussion on the motion? If not, all in favor, please signify.
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion is carried. Thank you all very, very much for your attendance this evening. I hope you don't get caught in the rain going home. And I will send out the, I realize that these wisecracks I'm making are immortal, I guess. Maybe I should,
Posterity.
maybe I should stop.
No.
No, never.
Okay, so thank you all, and I'll get the materials to you this week that I said I would. Thanks so much. All the best.
Good
You
night.
Have a good-
Have a good trip, Ellen. Bye.
Thank you.
Enjoy, Ellen.
Thanks.